As we saw in the last video, we've got a router CFC file, and most of what this file does is it contains this configure method, and inside there are various route statements that point to different sections of our application. We can use route to point to a URL that then runs a block of code. We can point to URLs that have JSON style values that get returned if we're building some sort of API or placeholder for an API. We can also use route placeholder values like we have here, where we had a route / messages and then placeholders for year, month, and day, or just year and month, or just year. We can combine those into routes with optional placeholders, and we have our default value here as well that handles everything else in our route statement. This route function and the supported methods that go along with it act as sort of their own DSL, or domain-specific language. You can do lots of things in this router CFC file, and they work as their own sort of mini language within the Coldbox environment itself. There are things you can do in router CFC that don't make any sense elsewhere in your Coldbox application, but here in this file, they're incredibly powerful. Over here in the Coldbox documentation, there's a section on routing methods. You can see here it covers some of the basic things we've seen before. I can go to a route like wiki with a page name placeholder in there. That goes to wiki page. You can look for regex patterns, point to different routes that way in your application. You can use inline responses, where you have a pattern you look for and then just run a block of code right there within your route statement, as opposed to going off to another actual event handler in one of your handler CFC files. You can route to specific events, and you can get really complex with some of this stuff. Here's sort of a basic route. Go to this route format and actually point to this event when you hit that route. You can give your routes names, say go route to this thing as user profiles, and then go point to the profiles.show event within the user's module. You can also gang several other methods together and get even more specific with that sort of syntax for different routes in your application. Here we've got a route that goes to our users. It's going to look for a placeholder for the ID property, and we're going to go to /profile after that. So an example of this might be a user profile in your application where the URL would eventually become /users /555 /profile, and you would see the profile for user number 555. That route's then going to get named as user profile. It's going to get routed with the HTTP verb get, as opposed to post or delete and the various other REST API options you have. We're going to do it with SSL, so this is a secure route. You can pass different values into the header for that request. I can even add values into the private request context for this event when it runs through this route. And then eventually, of course, take all of that and send it over to the profile.show handler in the user's module in our application. And all of that is one route statement in your router CFC file. But we've combined the route method with 6 other helper methods to get the functionality we need. And again, none of this would really work or make sense elsewhere, but it all runs this very powerful sort of functionality for you here in your router CFC file. You can also combine custom combinations of views and layouts onto specific routes in your application, again by using the route method that we've mentioned earlier, and just combining that with the toView helper method. Here you can see we're going to the contact us route, and then I've got the toView method attached on the end to go to a custom view or layout combination for this specific route. So maybe by default, the event that contact us points to has a particular layout attached to it, but when people go to this specific route /contact-us, as opposed to maybe /contact or /help or whatever other option you want to have in your application, when they go here, you can override whatever the default layout and view is and specify a custom specific one just for this route. I can also specify routing to redirects. If you are doing a rebuild of a website, for example, maybe you have old URLs that no longer exist on your new Coldbox version of the application. Rather than just having all of your users go to a 404 page and not getting the information that they used to receive, you can use route plus the .to redirect function and give all of those old URLs a 301 redirect option. And again, you can control all of that from here in your router CFC file. Not only that, but using the 301 redirect also gives your site a little bit of an SEO boost as opposed to Google or other search engines hitting a 404 page and just getting the information not found. Those search engines will get a 301 sent back to them, which then tells the search engine, hey, this information has moved to this new URL, in this case, /new/pattern. And the search engines can then update themselves internally, giving your site better SEO results than they would get if they just got 404 not found results from the old previously used URL. REST is a very popular framework these days for building APIs in web applications, not only just for having publicly available APIs for your customers to use, but they're also very common ways people build backend applications to power things like Angular and Vue.js applications. You can control your RESTful actions in your Coldbox app, again, with the route commands in your router CFC file. You always start with the route function like we saw before, and you can simply add on the with action helper method on the end, and then tell it which HTTP verb you want to use, get, put, post, or delete, and then point it to whichever action in your handler you're going to execute when that particular HTTP verb is requested by the browser or the client. The router CFC also allows you to create inline responses via closures or lambdas and enhance other incoming URL patterns to get extra functionality out of your application. You don't need to create handler and actions. You can simply put these new pieces of functionality in line as responses in your router CFC file. Here you can see we have route that just goes to /users_hello, and I've got a function right in there that gets the event, request context, and private request context passed in as arguments, and I can simply use them in my function if I want, or ignore them and just return hard-coded HTML if that's all I need to do here. Here's a little bit more of an involved example. Route going to, instead of /users and a hard-coded link like hello, it goes to the placeholder username, and username will become a value in the RC scope in your application. You can see I'm using it here as rc.username right there, again, as an inline variable in this function right in the middle of my route method call. I'm not actually going out to an event handler CFC to execute this. Taking that a step farther, we've got a route here going to /users and / again, a placeholder for our ID. And then I can simply use the toResponse method to sort of wrap this inline function. And we can do whatever we want in here as if it were a regular event handler CFC. I can go out and get an instance of my user service using the dependency injection functionality baked into Coldbox that's provided by Wirebox. We'll get into that in a later video. And go hit that rc.id variable that was passed in our route. If we got an object loaded by that CFC, go ahead and return that and we'll use it. If we didn't get anything back, we can set error codes and say invalid user provided, and then just return that error message back to the front end as, in this case, a JSON string. For example, maybe we're powering an Angular or a Vue.js app. We can have all of this done this way and then return JSON back to the client-side app, whether it's Vue or React or Angular or whatever else we happen to have out there. And all of this can be done here in your router CFC file just by using these extra helper methods .toResponse and the inline functions. You can even do what we call subdomain routing with your router CFC file. Here we've got two examples of that. I can take any incoming URL, and if it's simply someone going to the main website .com or .dev in this case, point them to the index page on our website. On the other hand, if someone's going to a particular subdomain of our website, maybe this is a multi-tenant application where different users get their different subdomains as they log in. Say, for instance, Vandalay Industries might have a site on here called vandalay.forgebox.dev. If somebody goes to that particular subdomain, then I can forward them to subdomain.show. And again, since the highlighted portion of your screen username is a placeholder, that will become available in my RC scope as a variable I can then use to point users to the correct piece of data, log them in as the Vandalay user, draw the company name on the screen properly, whatever the thing is that I need to do with that subdomain information. And again, this can all be done from your router CFC file. You can also do what we call extension detection with your router CFC file. Here's some sample URLs on the screen. We typically see things like this in our application, localhost /users, and that goes to the user's event handler and runs some sort of default action in that file. Notice down here we have a few other URLs, users.json, users.xml, and so on. There's not an action called JSON in that handler CFC, nor is there a method called XML or PDF or HTML. These are extensions, and we're using the set extension detection functionality baked into Callbox. What this will let us do is we can look at the extension of a URL that's coming into our application and return different types of data or different formats of data based on those extensions. So in this case, we'd have a URL called localhost/users, and that does something like draw a list of users on the screen that use our application, or customers from last week, whatever the context of your application might be. The .json part on the end means that this data would be returned not as an HTML formatted UI that users could look at in a browser, but instead it would come back as a JSON string that you could consume through a front-end application, through a mobile app, things like that. Same thing with .xml. Take that same data and return it back in XML format, return it as an Acrobat PDF file for users to print out and do whatever they want with that way. Or of course, you can return it as plain HTML like we talked about previously. So you can see there's lots of powerful functionality all baked into your router CFC file that's there for you to use in your Callbox applications. And just like all of the other features in Callbox, the default behavior in your router CFC file will work for most everything you need to do. You don't actually have to go in there and turn on any of this custom functionality unless you actually plan on using it for something. You can do create Callbox app from the command box command line, and everything that's created for you in your router CFC file at the beginning will work just fine. Then you simply turn on other features as you need them. Let's look at the extension detection feature in action here in our application, rather than just looking at the documentation for it. I've got a route here called /u that goes to our users list page. And you can see that I'm not doing anything else in here. There's no placeholders for other types of data. There's no closures. There's no other anything happening. This is merely a shortcut. Rather than typing users.list, I can go to /u, and what happens on our users list page will work the same way if I just go to /u in the browser. And there's our users list thing. Let's go take a look at our handler real quick. Here's our users list handler. And in here I have this little bit of code in the middle that says if we have a variable called format defined in our RC scope, we're going to run this event.renderData thing here. There's no format variable being provided by our route anywhere, is there? So at first, this might look like a typo. It's not. If I go here to my URL and simply add, let's say, .json onto the end of the URL, first you can see that our entire web page turns into JSON output. The header and footer are gone. It's just JSON data being returned back to our application. So how does that happen? This extension that I type in here, u.json, everything after the period, the .json part, gets automatically turned into this rc.format variable for us. I'm simply passing that variable into my render data function as the type of data I want to render. And here I'm passing the array that we created up here in line 36 into the data attribute on that function. This line of code is basically shortcutting what normally would be the output of our website. No header and footer is being outputted. The layout stuff is not happening now. Instead, we're using this if statement to say, I don't want you to draw the regular default HTML output of this web page. I want you to draw the format of this data in JSON for me. And that's all we had to do, was call this event.renderData function, and we got our entire app to output as JSON. I can go here to the browser and change that to .xml, and it will output all of that data for us as XML as well. So this is a really powerful feature, this extension detection stuff that happens automatically in Callbox. It's a really easy way to take quote-unquote normal views in your application and really quickly turn them into JSON APIs or XML APIs. And you can turn your application into an API that you can then use with mobile applications, use with your vendors and other customers and things of that nature. You don't have to build an entire separate code base to turn a part of your application into an API. You can do everything from one code base where you have your traditional output, like so. And in that exact same view, I can simply go up here and say, also please output that data as plain XML or plain JSON, Acrobat PDF, or HTML. You can even provide custom formats to your data if you want to get really, really fancy with what you can do in Callbox. And all of this is being done basically by just this one line of code here in my list handler. I don't even technically have to do much more than just add this little bit of the route here. I put a route in, say /u, and then I have my extension detection happening, which provides the RC format variable. And then I call that variable in my event.renderData method. And now I have a JSON API or an XML API for any facet of my application that I want to have, all from Coldbox's baked-in functionality and this event.renderData function. The router CFC also allows you to create inline responses via closures or lambdas and enhance other incoming URL patterns to get extra functionality out of your application. You don't need to create handler and actions. You can simply put these new pieces of functionality in line as responses in your router CFC file. Here you can see we have route that just goes to /users hello, and I've got a function right in there that gets the event, request context, and private request context passed in as arguments, and I can simply use them in my function if I want, or ignore them and just return hard-coded HTML if that's all I need to do here. Here's a little bit more of an involved example. Route going to, instead of /users and a hard-coded link like hello, it goes to the placeholder username, and username will become a value in the RC scope in your application. You can see I'm using it here as rc.username right there, again, as an inline variable in this function right in the middle of my route method call. I'm not actually going out to an event handler CFC to execute this. Taking that a step farther, we've got a route here going to /users and again, a placeholder for our ID. And then I can simply use the toResponse method to sort of wrap this inline function. And we can do whatever we want in here as if it were a regular event handler CFC. I can go out and get an instance of my user service using the dependency injection functionality baked into Coldbox that's provided by Wirebox. We'll get into that in a later video. And go hit that rc.id variable that was passed in our route. If we got an object loaded by that CFC, go ahead and return that and we'll use it. If we didn't get anything back, we can set error codes and say invalid user provided, and then just return that error message back to the front end as, in this case, a JSON string. For example, maybe we're powering an Angular or a Vue.js app. We can have all of this done this way and then return JSON back to the client-side app, whether it's Vue or React or Angular or whatever else we happen to have out there. And all of this can be done here in your router CFC file just by using these extra helper methods .toResponse and the inline functions.